Conrad and Bean took off running, heading south to Bench Crater. Yesterday, during the first moonwalk, Bean had found that running on the moon was an experience all its own. He watched as Conrad skipped like a little boy and laughed with delight. Whee! Up one crater and over another. Does that look as good as it feels? Bean had discovered a better way. Pete, bend and take a rock from side to side as you run, like that. There you go. It wasn't really a run, it was more of a lope. Push off with one foot, shift your weight, and land on the other. Each step launched him into the air for long seconds while he wondered whether he would land on a rock or in a pothole. To avoid this, he tried sticking his foot out to one side, but when he landed and pushed off again, his uneven stance set him slowly rotating, giving him a new problem to deal with. He soon learned to anticipate each new step while he was still airborne, shifting his weight as he landed and immediately pushing off, setting up a rhythm as if he were bounding across a rocky stream. It felt strange, and it was demanding. He couldn't take his eyes off the ground very often, but that only made it more fun, and the moon afforded him a luxury unknown to any runner on Earth, a chance to relax in the midst of each step. It seemed, to Bean's amazement, that he would never get tired. By the way, Conrad radioed Houston, this is the smartest idea we've come up with. This map just works great out here. It worked great for Conrad, but most of the time, Bean didn't have the foggiest idea of where he was. From the surface, really big craters like Head and Bench looked nothing like the big circular bowls on the map. Bean tried to navigate a few times on his own and gave up. It was beyond him how Conrad, running ahead of him, managed to study the map even as he bounded along. While Conrad led the way, Bean scanned the ground for something interesting. It wasn't easy to do field geology at a full gallop, and on the moon it wasn't much easier standing still. Everything was so dust-covered that only the most subtle variations in texture were visible. Even the rocks looked almost exactly alike, until he held one right up to his faceplate. Then he could see hints of what lay beneath the dusty coating. The green glint of olivine crystals, or a chunky white grain of feldspar. He could even see tiny pits, actually craters made by micrometeorites, peppering the sides of the rock. And he was telling Houston all about it when... Hey, Al, quit baloneying and give me a hand, Conrad cut him off. Bean understood the geologists were going to have the rest of their lives to study these rocks. Why waste time talking about them? In the back of Conrad's mind, he was thinking, got to get around the circle. The spindly white probe in Conrad's mind, the mission's finish line, was waiting for them. Fortunately, Ed Gibson had good news. The moonwalk was being extended by half of an hour. You know what I feel like, Al? What? Did you ever see those pictures of giraffes running in slow motion? Bean laughed. He knew what Conrad was talking about. He watched Conrad's feet as he ran along beside him. Each time his boots hit the surface, they sprayed a small shower of dust, sailing out on perfect trajectories. And they ran by the southern rim of Bench Crater, and they were beginning to feel the strain of their adventure. The entire run to the Surveyor Crater was slightly uphill, and they could definitely feel it. Their mouths were as dry as the desert from breathing pure oxygen. Tell you one thing I'd go for is a good drink of ice water. To make matters more difficult for Bean, the tool carrier was getting heavy with rocks. He had to hold it up to his chest while he ran to keep the rocks from bouncing out. This meant he was constantly fighting the arms of the suit. Before the mission, he'd been so conscientious about exercise. Every day he'd run a couple of miles on the hard bench at the Cape, pounding his legs into shape. And it turned out that most of the work was in the arms, and especially the hands. He told Ed Gibson to pass on a message to Fred Hayes, the lunar module pilot for Apollo 13, to do hand exercises. Meanwhile, in Houston, the flight surgeon saw Conrad and Bean's heart rates soar to 160 beats per minute. Ed Gibson passed on a message from the surgeon to Lunar Surface in code. Pete and Al, we'd like an EMU check. EMU stood for Extravehicular Mobility Unit. In other words, the spacesuit and backpack. Ostensibly, this is a request for each man to read out his oxygen supply and report any anomalies in suit pressure or the like. But in reality, it let Gibson tell the men to cool it for a couple of minutes, without letting the whole world know about it. Conrad and Bean got the message, and they read out their oxygen quantity and the rest of it. But they couldn't bring themselves to stand around and do nothing. An interesting rock caught their eye, and they set about collecting it. Then they were on the run again. Everyone in Mission Control could hear them huffing and puffing. The two men ran onward in their long, gliding, slow-motion giraffe strides under the black dome of the lunar sky. Bean looked up as he ran above the solar glare and found a glittering crescent set in the velvet, exactly where it had been the day before. He looked down at his feet again, watching out for potholes and rocks, then leaned his head back for another glance. For just a moment, he silenced the voice in his head that always called him back to work, to the rule of the clock, and he talked to himself. This is the moon. That is the earth. I'm really here. Suddenly, Bean felt his ears pop. His suit must be losing pressure. Heart pounding, he stopped and checked the gauge on his wrist. No change. It must have been some kind of weird transient. Only after the flight would the engineers decide that as Bean ran in the light gravity, his body had bounced against the oxygen outflow port within his suit, closing it momentarily and causing a slight increase in suit pressure. But just now, that taste of fear was enough to put Bean's thoughts right back onto the Traverse. After that, he stopped looking up for a while. Standing on the rim of the Surveyor crater, Conrad and Bean rested for a moment. Just beyond the far wall, they could see Intrepid. Like a tiny replica, to their right, 300 feet away, sat Surveyor 3, gleaming in the morning sunlight. Antennas and sensors still reached upward from its tubular frame, just as they had on April 20th, 1967, when the craft thumped onto the moon amidst blasts from its braking rockets. Like Intrepid, it had the strange organic look of a craft designed for the void of space.